You're tuning into the Careering with Cameron podcast, your safe place for asking all the dumb questions about finding a job. Hi, I'm Kevin Cameron. Welcome back to Careering with Cameron. Today's episode, we're going to dive into something that really challenges folks that are interviewing. And we've gone through the process of finding opportunities, networking, connecting, making sure that we have all of the T's crossed and the I's dotted, making sure the resume looks good, making sure LinkedIn looks good. We've covered all of those pieces in previous episodes. And now we have an interview, and it's exciting. We're looking forward to going and being able to talk to somebody about an opportunity that we are passionate about. The challenge is, once that realization comes to us, and we now know, whoa, I'm going to be in an interview, our first response typically is, what will they ask me? What happens in the interview? What if they ask me questions I don't have the answers to? This is the second time we are going to be in a position where we get to format what we're looking for. So early on, when we talked a little bit about networking into opportunities and finding the right position, connecting to someone who can help us, that was driven towards finding an opportunity that aligns with what we're looking for, whether it's the company culture or whether it is really just making sure that the role is something where we can advance and learn, right? This is now the interview. You're sitting across from somebody, either on camera or in person, and talking about your background, and your immediate response, which is natural, is almost always, what will they ask me? But here's the thing. It's not really about what they're going to ask you. What they want to ask you is on your resume. It's an open book test. You already know where the questions are going to come from. They're on your resume and the job description. What we should be focusing on equally is, what are you going to ask them? Have you been in a situation where you're coming up on an interview and your stomach is a mess, it's turning, you're nervous, you can't figure out what's going to happen to you in the interview, and suddenly you realize nothing's going to happen to you in the interview. They're going to ask you questions about your background, and you're the only person who is there. So you should be able to answer those questions. Now, there are tips and tricks to work through answering those questions. Things like making sure that you answer them in a way that gives you a true picture of who you are and what you are doing for that position. But the flip side is your bailout in situations, and let's face it, some of us get nervous in these meetings. We get more nervous the less experience that we have. So interviewing is always a good exercise. But as we interview more, we find that the person who's across the desk or across the screen from us packs a lunch and puts on their work clothes the same way every day, the same way we do. We're all just people. So we need to just kind of calm down with the interview concerns and come back to, okay, what's the next step? The next step is, A, let's figure out what they're probably going to ask us based on the interview questions that would come to mind in terms of looking at gaps in resume and job description. How can we do that? Well, once again, there's this great tool called AI. Ask AI to tell you what the questions are. Depending on how experienced the person is who's interviewing you, they may be doing the exact same thing. So that's one real quick, easy, don't spend a lot of time, get some questions. You're building up a Rolodex, essentially, of questions that you think you're going to hear about based on the job description, company, and also your resume. That's a real easy softball. Smack that one. The next piece is, how do we figure out how to help guide the conversation? So, like I said, usually in an interview process, you're going to have an interview process that's set up where there's an initial screening, ideally, maybe it's HR, maybe it's a recruiter, who's going to want to talk to you about the keys of the position. They're going to want to know, what your interest is, what your background is. They're going to confirm a few things. It's not going to be a tremendously long exercise. Depending on where you live, they may or may not confirm your compensation, but they're going to want to have a thorough understanding of what you're looking for to make sure that you match up as well on that side of the fence. That's the first piece. The interview typically can include that person, but should also include somebody more than likely who's in, I'll call it the business, right? So they're in a management role where they are probably either going to be your manager or maybe a couple levels up. It all kind of depends, and it may be a panel as well. There's a lot of different ways this can go, and if you have questions on that, please reach out. But the secret of this whole thing is you get to ask questions. Don't ever forget that. You're allowed to ask questions the same way the person in the interview is asking you questions. And what those questions really should look like are a few really good ones that I always recommend. What does success look like in this role? And it's basically, how can I be successful? How can I guarantee you that if you pick me, you're going to be successful because I'm going to be successful, right? That's a nice question to include in almost every interview. Ask what the culture is like in the organization. Ask what they like the best about working for XYZ company. Ask them, what is the reason why the position is open? If you are somebody who's beginning your career and you want to advance, it would be a good thing if you knew that the position is open because the last person who was in it was promoted. That's a great sign for you, and it's a great sign for them to be able to share that. If it's a situation where somebody left and there's nobody there, then obviously we want to have an idea why, and we can cover that probably in a future episode. But also making sure that if the position is open and it's open because it's a brand new role, that's pretty exciting. That's another whole direction that you can go. Now you have to ask questions, or want to ask questions, I should say, around why is this position being created? What's critical to you in this role? So there's a lot of different places you can go. Where do you not go in your interview is, how much time off do we have? Could I delay my start until 2 months from now? Questions that make it sound like you may not be as interested in the role as you are the benefits, okay? And there is a time to ask questions about benefits. It is not the first interview. In a lot of cases, you will have somebody who's either HR, recruitment, maybe hiring manager, that will send you a benefits summary when things get moving. Sometimes they do it early on, sometimes they don't. You should absolutely have that summary or something similar before you're accepting an offer. But the first interview is not the time to talk about, okay, how many days off am I going to have this year? How many sick days do I have? That's an indication that you may not be all that serious about being at work in this job, right? So the questions we want to ask: what do you like most about this opportunity? Why is this opportunity created? Why is it open? Tell me about the team. Tell me what you're most excited for in this role. Tell me what you think my experience with TUV company combining with XYZ company will help you to do. I want to share more about my experience and how I can work with you and bring those experiences from previous to this role. Those are areas where we really want to cover. There's a couple last questions we always ask. We always close the interview, and we close that interview in a way that we always say, I really enjoyed this conversation with you. Do you have any concerns at this point about me as a candidate for this role that we haven't addressed yet? You want to always close with that question. And ideally, they will say one of two things. No, I'm going to recommend that you move forward to the next interview. Or, you know what, Kevin? I'm not sure about how much experience you have working with lasers. So, we need to talk a little bit more about your laser experience, or is there something you can share with me that would help me to understand how much experience you have working with lasers? That is something you want to know now, not later on, not after you hang up, not after you leave. You want to make sure you know that, because you can address it right then and there and share a little bit more about your experience with lasers. Then you also want to make sure that you're able to respond to them with a thank you note, which we will always, always, always do. But we want that thank you note to include summarizing how you're a good fit and how you can overcome that concern that they believe that they have. And maybe it's valid, maybe it's not. But you want to make sure that you take one more crack at solving that Rubik's for them so that they know you can do this job, right? Side note to that, your thank you note should also have something specific to your conversation in it. If you have somebody who is interviewing 15, 20 people, they may not remember exactly who you are when they are reading the thank you note. That will help to jog their memory. Something specific causes another point of connection for you where they say, oh, yes, I remember Kevin sitting with me. Now I know exactly who this is. I can replay that conversation in my head and really reconnect with A, your thank you note, and B, with you. Okay. The last question after the last question, which I realize I already said last question, but the last question after the last question is, what's the timeline for this role? When do you think you're going to be able to make a decision? Or what is the next step in your interview process? Personally, I like what is the next step in the interview process much better. Typically, I find that people who do not do a lot of hiring, if you ask them when they're going to be able to make a decision, they get kind of nervous. You're pushing a little bit harder on them. Somebody who has been out interviewing, maybe they're 15, 20 years into their career, they can ask that question pretty easily. Everybody knows what's going on. That's typically okay. More entry level, maybe first, second job, you want to ask questions about what does the timeline look like for this role? When do you think, I will hear from you again in terms of next steps? What are the next steps? And going from there. Make sure to go along with your thank you note, you get their email. Or if you're in person, you get a card. Ask for a card. If they don't have a card or you're not in person, just say, would it be okay for you to share your email with me so I can follow up? That's all we need. And don't be upset if they come back and say you can follow up with the recruiter. That's fine. But typically people are more than likely okay with sharing that information. The next piece really is, we've gone through kind of the first part, last part of the interview component. Some tips to keep in mind along the way. Make sure you've done your homework. And I don't only mean your homework on the company or the job. You should know if the person that you're meeting with is an alumni of the same organization or same school or college that you went to. You should know if they are an alum of a school that maybe somebody in your family went to, and maybe they're around the same age. You should also know if you were referred to them, who referred you. These are things we should know. We should have some background. We don't need to have background down to the point where we know, where their kids play sports and what teams they're on. That's what we call creepy. But we should know some rough idea on a professional level of who they are. So we can also ask questions. And if there's an opportunity where they bring up something that's a little bit more personal in terms of like, well, I went to Penn, and when I went to Penn, I found that this was the opportunity I was interested in. If you're going to Penn now, you want to be able to say, oh, that's fantastic. Were you in whatever building, or did you have whomever as a professor, or whatever it may be? Chances are there's not going to be a direct connection there, but you never know. And it reminds them that you have this commonality with them. You're both alums of the same school. So use that. Depending on where you are in the country, it may even go down to high school, right? So there are a lot of areas where what school did you go to actually doesn't mean college or university. It actually means high school, depending on where you are. Delaware's big on what school did you go to means what high school. So interesting kind of sidebar there. Make sure you're doing your homework, like I said, on the person. Make sure that you know something beyond just job description relations about the company. A favorite interview question for people to ask is, so what do you know about Talent Connect? If you come back blank with that question, that you have literally been judged. And the immediate response is going to be, this is someone who is not serious about this job. They are applying to lots of jobs. They haven't done their homework. They're just hopping on the call because we scheduled a time with them. You've got to have something about each organization. And if you are doing something via video conference, it's a very easy tool to have something right down the side of your screen, or you can use Post-its. Put Post-its on the side of your screen. Make sure you have some information that's there. We do provide a spreadsheet that tracks this information. So if you had interest in that, I'm happy to chat with you about that as well. But that would track pertinent information, people, how you met them, all that good stuff. There's some nice tools in there. So, that's the next piece. But make sure you have done your homework on the organization. Make sure you've done your homework on the person. Lastly, they're going to ask you questions. They're probably going to be questions that are going at a specific area of conversation. There is a type of question called a star question, right? And so, what are we looking at with star questions? So, star questions, it's an acronym, stand for situation, task, action, and result. So, what we are looking for by asking you a star question, you'll know when they hit because they sound like, can you tell me about a time when? That's usually a star question, and it's driving at something specific, which is I need you to walk me through the STAR, situation, task, action, and result, with your answer because I'm going to be grading you on that answer. Should we be terrified? No. It's just that we have to get used to answering questions with that acronym in mind. So it's a good thing to practice. How do you practice? You can practice with your friends, you can practice with your colleagues, you can actually practice with your pets. Pets are very good to practice with. They pay attention no matter what, for the most part, as long as there's food. So make sure that you are comfortable with how do I answer a star type question. There are behavioral interview questions. The acronym, like I said, is STAR. You will find a ton of information online on how to answer them, but you need to be comfortable with that because if you are somebody who can get conversationally, my word, in your interview, and you answer questions in a very comfortable, conversational way, the person on the other side may be totally into the conversation and have zero notes on your conversation because they were having a great chat with you. If you don't walk them through STAR, they don't have any background to go back to say, this person's a great hire and here's why. When I asked them this question, this is what they said. So make sure that you have that covered. Make sure you're going through it when you get to those behavioral based interview questions so that you're making sure that they have what they need after you walk away from them to be able to give you a great score in your interview. That's another component of this, right? So what can those questions look like? Well, typically it'll be, can you tell me about a time that you worked on a challenging project? Can you tell me about a time you were part of a team that was growing? Can you tell me about a time that you worked on new technology? And then there'll be a second part to it. So new technology with a challenging delivery deadline or a brand new team or a demanding client base, something along those lines. And it could be anything like that. So they're looking for setting up a scenario where there was a challenge and how did you overcome that challenge? It's kind of like, what's your weakness? Which I don't really hear as much about anymore. But what's your weakness was famous for, I want you to tell me how you overcome challenging situations, right? So the what's your weakness was always, you would say something like, I'm too organized. And then the person would write down you're too organized, and you would come back and say, so I'm overcoming that by finding ways to streamline my organization to keep it part of my process, but also make sure that my process is moving swiftly, right? So that's kind of a simple softball type answer. That's one piece. The next piece of this really is making sure that you've got STAR covered. You've got questions about them that you are going to tee off with and ask them questions about the organization. You're going to be able to close by finding out what the next step looks like, making sure that there are no objections that you don't see or you didn't talk about in the interview process. That's a pretty well-rounded interview to have all of your bases covered in terms of what you need to worry about and what's coming next. After that, the only real piece that you need to kind of walk through with them is to understand, how have they found the interview process so far? You can ask questions like, have you found that it's a large candidate pool? You can ask questions like, what's the biggest challenge you have found in finding applicants to screen? That may be kind of interesting to you. If they're more conversational, that's some place that you can go. If they come back and say, we had 2 people, you're one of them, that align with what we're looking for, that's a pretty good indication. So those are things to be focused on. Beyond there, really making sure that you're having a good conversation in terms of eye contact. Make sure that when you're answering questions, you're answering directly to them, making sure you're not getting lost in a lot of details. Also, if this is a role where you're leading an operation, We want to make sure that you are illustrating that correctly when you're answering questions. So people have a tendency to use we for everything that they did in their previous role. We is great if they're looking to bring you in as a individual contributor and not manage anything. But if you're going to be managing something or your skill set is specific, you're going to need to work on I and not we. And really, the difference can be tremendous in terms of your evaluation for the interview process. You can find that people are really hung up on the fact that you use we more than I or I more than we because they get stuck on the fact that did you do the work or did a team do the work and were you just in the room, right? That's the example. In sales type capacities, I. It's all I, right? In group type capacities, it's more we, but you have to have some I in there, okay? It can't be all we. You can't be the good teammate the whole way through. You have to have had contributions and led and driven process and things like that that you can utilize, whether that's in small groups if you're in a graduate program or undergrad, or whether it's in a project team in a workforce, right? Either way, but you've got to make sure that you have the right description there of we or I. And it really should bounce back and forth, and it should not be one the whole way through. I have seen interviews lost just in that term alone. Last thing I can share with you to make sure you're 100% prepared and make sure you are ready to go ace this interview. Make sure you write down questions. Make sure you're taking notes on the answers to the questions. But make sure when you are taking notes, you are still making eye contact. I actually always appreciate doing interviews if somebody says to me, would it be okay if I took a few notes on our conversation? I love that. That means you're actually invested in the conversation. That actually means that after the fact, not only am I going to get a thank you note, but you're going to know all about our conversation and be able to recall it when ideally you come back for your next round or we extend an offer to you and bring you in. So make sure that you say, would it be okay if I took some notes? Make sure you're still making eye contact with them. You're still connected to them through screen or in person. No head down the whole time writing, but make sure that you're making that eye contact with them. And lastly, if it is something where you are meeting with multiple people at once, I get this question quite a bit. I would have questions for you to choose kind of who you're going to. A lot of times, if it's a panel, okay, they're going to say, do you have questions? You're going to come back and say, well, actually, I do. Can you tell me about what the culture is like here? I would want you to focus that question to a person that's there. I wouldn't just want to throw it out as a softball because that kind of comes across as less prepared than you ordinarily could be. So you want to ask questions to specific people. And what's really impressive is that if you have all their names knocked down going in, you're going to be nervous. It's going to be a challenge. Make a quick note when you walk in and sit down that you know who's where and you know how to refer to them, right? So if you come back and say, Kevin, I'm curious if you can describe a little bit more about the culture working here. You've been here for 10 years, and I think that I would really value, your feedback in terms of how the culture has evolved and where you see it going. Those are great things to ask, right? And the fact that you called me out by name is fantastic. I may say, here are my thoughts, and then transfer it to somebody else on the team, ideally somebody in like organizational development or something like that. But the fact that you asked specifically and you knew my name out of the gates, great. So that gives you points, right? Those are things that will help you. I cannot emphasize enough asking questions that are going to bring back at least one specific thing, right? One thing that they're going to remember. Do not rely on AI for all your questions. Make sure that it's a question that you think nobody else is going to ask within reason. But make sure it's a question that is something like, what is success is something people typically ask. A lot of people ask that question. How did you choose this role? What are you most excited about for this role and the contribution that it will make to the team? Those are good questions to ask that'll give you a specific answer, and they'll remember that, right? Make sure we're doing that. please, please, please make sure we're following up. Please make sure we know what the timeline looks like for next steps. And please make sure that while it may be a very nerve-wracking situation to come into the first few interviews if you are out of practice or just starting, the person on the other side of the desk is just as nervous. I promise you they are. Every interview, a hiring manager is nervous to get started. So make it as easy as possible. Smile. Make eye contact. Ask them how they're doing. How's their day going? Get some of that connecting up front so that they feel like you're a person I can talk to and be comfortable with. Then they will tell you a lot more, right? If you're super stiff and reserved, not so great. Easy on the coffee as well, so you're not flying through their office, right? But those are really the secrets that I think help quite a bit in the interview process. And then it's really about following up and making sure that you are following up and making sure that that follow-up happens inside of 5 days if they are, at a point where they're like, hey, we're going to make a decision. 3 days max. If they are in a point where there's another round, they're going to take the next week to finish this round. Okay, that might be 5 days, but 3 to 5 days, no more. We should not get to a week before following back up again. If you think about when you receive an email and it's something that you need to kind of deal with, but it's not something that's a pressing situation, how often do you get to 7 days and think, oh, I wish I forgot all about this. I need to get back to this person. Don't let it get to 7 days. 5 days max. Make sure you're back to them, okay? Don't let somebody else have that window that you created to sneak in and take your job. So that's the other piece. I hope you enjoyed today's show. If you have questions, please reach out. I love answering interview questions. I really enjoy talking to people about how to prepare for those interviews, and that's something that we certainly do through coaching. Please, please make sure that if there's somebody you know that's about to go on an interview that could use this episode for help, share it with them, subscribe, rate, and follow. I look forward to seeing you next time. Talk to you soon. Stay in the loop at careeringwithcameron.com/talent connect or check out our website, www.talent-connect.net.